All right, so let's continue with our. I want to talk about this reading, which was recommended readings. You can find it by we can find it by like someone in Christian Cron, and what Christian Cron is intended to in this say is he wanted to talk about the way that certain European countries developed economically and his big point is that he said there are not single path to industrialization. If your goal is to industrialize, to go from being an agriculture country to becoming an industrialized state that has a lot of manufacturing going on, he says there can be different paths, different and let's just look at those kind of paths which he suggests. He said the very important question that you have to ask, the key to the variation to the different kinds of outcome that you can get is the degree to which banks are involved in industrialization. In that, move from being a more rural agricultural society to being a more urban manufacturing society. Did the banks help out or not? So, for instance, for the case of UK, we saw that banks actually were involved very little in this. They chose to invest in the business that exists there. So that required anyone who had a private business, who wanted to start a factory, who wanted to trade abroad, they had to raise the capital on their own. They had to find an investor. They had to find an investor who would jump on board, and for that reason, although the UK were first to industrialize, you see that in our previous readings how industrial revolution happened in UK. It actually went very slowly. It took over 60, 70 years to pass from the late 1700s to the early 1800s for the UK, when finally much more fully industrialized. So in the UK, what happens when um, you don't have the government pushing for this very heavily? It was up to private companies to do this, and this took a longer to industrialize. It was up to private companies to do this, and it now, of course, they were still the first to industrialize, but they had a big head start on everybody else. Now, this is in contrast to the countries such as Germany, where the banks were always very heavily involved in business, and when the move came for industrialization, the banks were on board. They were ready to start lending money, so they could immediately amass a lot of money, and government could push the banks to certain degree. These weren't just private banks. They could push the banks to invest in certain kinds of businesses, and the banks wanted to invest in heavy industry, steel, engineering, chemicals, and things like that. So Germany started to industrialize much later, in the later half of the 1800s, but caught up with the British very, very quickly because of the tremendous weight, the amount of money that the banks had there, and the businesses didn't have to first go looking and wait a while to find a private investor. They could just count on the banks, which were being driven a little bit by government to create this investment. That is how the Germans caught up so much. A third example is that Christian Kron gives is that of Soviet Union or former USSR, where there were banks, but they were not involved. No one trusted banks. Uh, these are just there are just the czars, and so what happened was that the state really had to seize the reign. They seized the banks, controlled the banks, and invested very heavily. But there was no banks as middlemen. It was the state itself funding all these things, and that set the stage. And this has happened even before communism. And once communism set in, it was more of the same, far much more of the same, where government organized everything and provided the money and had the ownership of these businesses. So industrialization happened to the tune of what government wanted. And of course, the Soviet Union industrialized very, very quickly, within a generation, from 1917, where the revolution uh, happened, to 1940s. They advanced tremendously. Didn't mean that people were fantastically better off in terms of what they could buy, but they had electricity and they had railroads and things like that. And that it just happened because the government had seized complete control of, and of course the cost was there was no private property. So the conclusion that he draws is he says, if the spurred like character of industrialization in Europe in the 19th century is thought of being as a result of pre-industrialized condition, in this he always called some backward countries. For him, backward simply means a country that has not industrialized yet. Then it is easier to understand the desire to move fast. Say, the tendency in the backward countries to concentrate much of their effort on the introduction of modern plants and expensive technology is only normal. So, in every instances of industrialization, the limitation of the evolution of the advanced country, meaning like the UK and then later the US, these countries that came later or industrialized later are probably going to be following a different model, right? They can't just wait for capitalism to slowly develop the way it did in the US and the UK. They are going to follow a different model that would be a lot more like the USSR. And that's important for us to keep in mind as we move forward, and then start to talk about the political economies of the developing world. So these of the developing world when we talk in the future classes. So this is the extra reading which Grishchenko talked about, and the backwardness. So the basic so in conclusion, what he was trying to say is that the newer developing countries which wants to industrialize would surely follow the alternative path than what UK or US followed, because it took so much time for them to industrialize. Now they might be tempted to follow the USSR model with heavy government involvement in industrializing their society. So this is very important to keep in mind. As I mentioned again, that when we started to talk about the political economies of the developing world.